how should Matthew know what Herod Antipas is saying to his servants in the privacy of his own palace? When we turn to Luke chapter 8, we find the name Joanna. And then there's a brief parenthetical description. Joanna is the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager. And at that point, it's no longer a mystery how Matthew could have known what Herod was saying to his servants. Jesus' followers had family in the highest ranks of Herod's servants. That's an undesigned coincidence.
This video is a continuation of my previous discussion about the limitations of undesigned coincidences. In that video, I examined the feeding of the 5,000. Here, I will discuss another example used by Tim McGrew and explain why I do not think it works as intended. Before we get to that example, however, let me briefly restate what an undesigned coincidence is and explain my overarching objection to this apologetic method. As I understand it, an undesigned coincidence is supposed to be a special form of apparently independent convergent evidence. Two accounts contain incidental details that fit together in an unexpected way. One account may leave something unexplained or puzzling, while another account casually supplies a detail that resolves the difficulty. Because neither author appears to be deliberately coordinating with the other or openly attempting to provide corroboration, the agreement is described as undesigned. The word undesigned, therefore, refers to the supposed absence of deliberate coordination by the people producing the account. One person casually mentions something that unexpectedly explains or confirms a detail found in another person's testimony. My general objection is not that this could never happen when different witnesses have access to one another's testimony. Of course it could happen. My objection is that once the witnesses know what the others have said, it becomes extremely difficult to establish that the agreement was genuinely undesigned. We do not have direct access to the minds of the witnesses or authors. We cannot simply look at the detail that appears casual and confidently conclude that the person mentioning it was not thinking about another account, responding to an existing tradition, correcting a misunderstanding, filling in a known gap, or subtly reinforcing a story that the audience already knew. This is why most analogies used by proponents of undesigned coincidences involve witnesses who have not had access to one another's accounts. We are often asked to imagine two people independently describing a bank robbery, with one witness accidentally explaining a puzzling detail mentioned by the other. But that is not an appropriate comparison with the Gospels. The Gospel authors were not isolated witnesses being interviewed separately immediately after an event. They wrote within Christian communities in which stories about Jesus had already been repeated, taught, interpreted, and transmitted for decades. The authors may have had access to earlier written sources, oral traditions, community teachings, and in some cases, one another's works. Once those possibilities are introduced, a detail that appears incidental no longer demonstrates independence. It may reflect direct literary dependence, a common source, a shared oral tradition, deliberate supplementation, or simply the development of a story within a community familiar with earlier versions. The absence of obvious coordination is not the same thing as evidence of independence. That distinction is crucial. Proponents cannot merely point out that an author does not explicitly say, "I'm adding this detail to confirm the other account." Authors rarely announce all their literary intentions. The burden is on the apologist to establish that the accounts are genuinely independent and that the agreement is better explained by separate access to the historical event than by shared sources, oral traditions, or literary dependence. When witnesses have no access to one another's testimony, independence is easier to establish. But suppose two people discuss an event, hear one another's stories, and then one of them later mentions a detail that happens to fill a gap in the other person's account. How could we determine that the second person did not have the first account in mind? Merely describing the detail as casual or incidental does not answer that question. It is still speculation about the author's intentions. When we turn to the Gospels, the situation becomes even more complicated. First, we are not dealing with straightforward first-person eyewitness testimonies in which the authors identify themselves, explain exactly what they personally observed, and tell us how they obtained the rest of their information. We are dealing with formally anonymous narratives whose authors generally do not identify their individual sources. Second, these texts were written decades after the events they describe, after different versions of oral and written traditions had already circulated within Christian communities. These two facts seriously undermine the attempt to use undesigned coincidences as evidence of independent eyewitness testimony. Even when two details fit together, we usually lack the information necessary to determine whether the connection arose independently or through literary dependence, shared traditions, community knowledge, or deliberate narrative development. Proponents of this apologetic method may respond that the argument still works when one gospel contains an unexplained detail and another gospel supplies an apparently unrelated fact that happens to explain it. They argue that because the explanatory detail appears in a different context, the connection was probably not deliberate. But does it really work? Hello, my friends. This is Shen from Mindful Living. Welcome to the channel. Here we discuss the importance of critical thinking, especially when it comes to religion. I examine Christian apologetic arguments and bring their hidden assumptions and logical problems to the surface. If you enjoy content like this, please subscribe so that we can continue improving our reasoning together. Back to undesigned coincidences. Let's consider this example offered by Tim McGrew.
Matthew chapter 14 tells the story of the death of John the Baptist, and that's a story that we have in some of the other Gospels as well. But Matthew tells it with a detail that isn't found in those other Gospels. In Matthew 14, verses 1 and 2, Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee, turns to his servants and says, "What's this? Who's baptizing in the Jordan River? I had John killed." And then he goes on and he tells that story. We don't often focus on the words "to his servants," but that's what I'd like to focus on here because it raises a very natural question. Matthew is a former tax collector. Now he's a traveling preacher. How should Matthew know what Herod Antipas is saying to his servants in the privacy of his own palace? Now, it would be a fair answer to say, we don't know.
That's weird. What does Tim mean when he said we don't know? Why should this be treated as such a mystery? McGrew's presentation largely ignores the Synoptic Problem. According to the dominant scholarly view, Mark was written before Matthew and was one of Matthew's major sources. Matthew chapter 14 verses 1 to 12 closely follows the structure and content of Mark chapter 6 verses 14 to 29. The two accounts are not independent reports that happen to describe the same incident. Matthew is most likely rewriting Mark.
Matthew's account there looks a lot like Mark's account. He's about to launch into the account of the beheading of John the Baptist and leads into it with Matthew musing on who Jesus might be when he hears about him and thinking he's John the Baptist risen from the dead. And it sounds a lot like Mark in Matthew.
In Mark's version, various rumors are circulating about Jesus. Some people say that he is John the Baptist raised from the dead, while others identify him as Elijah or another prophet. When Herod hears this report, he concludes that John, whom he had beheaded, has been raised. Matthew shortens this material and directly has Herod tell his servants that Jesus is John the Baptist raised from the dead. So Matthew did not need some mysterious source inside Herod's palace to learn the basic contents of Herod's alleged statement. He already had that information in Mark. The more appropriate question would be, how did Mark learn what Herod supposedly said? That is a fair historical question, but it does not create any extraordinary mystery. Even if Herod made the statement inside his palace, he was not necessarily speaking in complete secrecy. Matthew explicitly places servants in the room. Palace servants Officials, guards, dinner guests, and household staff were not locked inside the palace and forbidden from speaking to outsiders. John the Baptist was a prominent religious figure with many followers. If Herod had executed him and later became frightened that John had returned from the dead, that would have made excellent gossip. It is not difficult to imagine a story like that spreading beyond the royal court. Perhaps one of Herod's servants repeated it. Perhaps someone heard it from someone else. Perhaps it began as a rumor about Herod's guilty conscience. Perhaps someone invented or embellished the story to ridicule him. We simply do not know. That uncertainty matters because we do not possess testimony from Herod confirming that he said these words. Mark does not identify his source, explain how the information was transmitted, or tell us how many people stood between the alleged statement and the written account. To be clear, this does not prove that the story is false. Ancient historians frequently had to rely on second-hand information, but it does mean that this passage is an unattributed report transmitted through an unknown number of people. It does not deserve the evidential weight McGrew tries to give it. And because Matthew most likely obtained the story from Mark, the presence of the story in both Gospels does not give us two independent sources. It gives us one account repeated and edited by a later author. You might ask, what about Matthew's additional detail that Herod spoke to his servant? Matthew may have obtained that detail from another tradition. That is certainly possible, but it is also possible that Matthew simply assumed that's what happened. If a ruler is speaking inside his court about reports circulating in the region, who would he most naturally be speaking to? His servants, attendants, advisors, guards, or other officials would be the obvious candidates. Matthew did not require privileged access to Herod's palace to add that detail. He could have added it because it made narrative sense. The addition may therefore be an ordinary piece of narrative clarification. It gives Herod someone to speak to. It does not necessarily preserve a separate historical memory. McGrew, however, argues that another passage solves the mystery.
When we turn to Luke chapter 8, we have a list of women who supported the ministry of Jesus and his disciples. And in that list, in verse 3, we find the name Joanna. And then there's a brief parenthetical description. Joanna is the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager. And at that point, it's no longer a mystery how Matthew could have known what Herod was saying to his servants. Jesus' followers had family in the highest ranks of Herod's servants. That's an undesigned coincidence.
No, it's not. I agree that when Luke mentioned Joanna and Chuza, he was probably not deliberately attempting to confirm the words to his servant in Matthew 14. The reference appears in an entirely different context. Luke is explaining how Jesus and his disciples received financial support. In that limited sense, Luke's detail appears incidental, but an incidental detail is not automatically an undesigned coincidence. For an undesigned coincidence to have evidential value, the two details must actually be connected. It is not enough that an apologist can imagine a connection between them. For now, let us focus on Luke's account. Luke identifies Joanna as the wife of Chuza, whom he describes as Herod's household manager, but we have no independent external confirmation that Joanna was Chuza's wife or that Chuza held this particular position in Herod's household. That does not prove Luke was wrong, but it means McGrew is building his arguments on a claim that we cannot independently verify. Even if we grant Luke's description as historically accurate, McGrew leaves out the most important problem. Luke never connects Joanna or Chuza to Herod's statement about Jesus being John the Baptist raised from the dead. Luke does not say that Chuza was present when Herod made the statement, or Chuza heard it from someone who was present. He does not say that Chuza told Joanna. He does not say that Joanna passed the information to Jesus' followers, and he certainly does not say that this information eventually reached Mark, whose account Matthew later used. That entire chain has been constructed by the apologist. The proposed transmission would have to look something like this. Herod made the statement. Chuza heard it. Chuza told Joanna. Joanna told members of the Jesus movement. The story circulated through the Christian community, and Mark eventually recorded it. Every step may be possible, but none of those steps is established by the gospel text. It is not undesigned coincidence. It is undesigned possibility. But possibility is not evidence. It is equally possible that the rumor about Herod had already been circulating publicly in several forms before Joanna even became associated with the Jesus movement. Perhaps palace servants spread it. Perhaps residents of Galilee repeated it. Perhaps it developed from speculation about Herod's fear and guilty conscience after executing John. Joanna is not required to explain how such a story could have circulated. And even if we could trace the information back to Joanna, that would not establish that the story was accurate. Perhaps Joanna heard it directly from Chuza, but perhaps Chuza heard it from another servant. Perhaps he embellished it before telling her. Perhaps Joanna misunderstood part of the story or retold it in a more dramatic form. Perhaps the story continued to change as it passed through the Christian community. That is how rumors and oral traditions often work. The problem is even greater than in a familiar telephone game, because the people transmitting the story were not required to preserve the wording exactly. They were free to interpret it, dramatize it, combine it with other rumors, or reshape it to make the story more memorable. The integrity of information becomes increasingly difficult to assess when it passes through several unidentified people before being written down. When apologists provide non-biblical examples of undesigned coincidences, they usually choose cases in which it is already clear that the different sources are discussing the same event. Alternatively, one source mentions a fact that can be connected to the other accounts through evidence that is reasonably secure. But that is precisely what is missing here. We do not know that Chuza heard Herod make this statement. We do not know that he told Joanna. We do not know that Joanna told Jesus' followers. We do not know that her report reached Mark or Matthew. Those connections are not discovered in the Gospels. They are artificially supplied to create the appearance of corroboration. Now suppose Luke had gone further. Imagine that Luke not only identified Joanna as Chuza's wife, but explicitly said that Joanna was the source from whom Christians learned about Herod believed Jesus was John the Baptist raised from the dead. Would that create a stronger example of an undesigned coincidence? Not really. It would provide better source attribution for the story, which could improve our understanding of how the tradition circulated, but it would weaken the claim that the connection was undesigned. If Luke explicitly connected Joanna to Herod's statement, then the clarification would appear deliberate. It would no longer be an incidental detail that unintentionally illuminates another account. This reveals a serious tension in the argument. When two passages are not explicitly connected, apologists must speculate that they are connected. But when a connection is explicit, it becomes more likely that the author intended the clarification, in which case it no longer qualifies as an undesigned coincidence. There is also another difficulty I would like to point out. Suppose the story really did originate with Joanna. Would that make the accounts in Mark, Matthew, and Luke independent corroboration? No, it would mean that several gospel traditions ultimately depended on the same source. Instead of three independent witnesses confirming Herod's statement, we would have several authors repeating a story that may have originated with Joanna, who allegedly heard it from her husband. The number of written accounts would not increase the number of independent sources. The story would still be only as reliable as the original transmission from Herod's court to Chuza, from Chuza to Joanna, and from Joanna to the early Christian community. None of those stages can be independently examined. The identity of the source could also affect how we evaluate the report. If the rumor came from a random residents of Galilee, we might have little reason to think that the person was trying to elevate Jesus' status. John the Baptist was a highly respected prophetic figure, so the claim that Jesus was John raised from the dead would naturally make Jesus appear extraordinary. But if the story came through a committed follower of Jesus, there would be a greater possibility that the tradition was preserved, emphasized, or shaped in a way that elevated Jesus. That does not prove deliberate fabrication. It simply means that the source would not be neutral, and we would have to consider the interests of the community transmitting the story. McGrew therefore faces several problems at once. First, Luke's mention of Joanna does not establish that she had anything to do with Herod's statement. Second, the proposed route from Herod to Chuza, from Chuza to Joanna, and from Joanna to the gospel tradition is entirely speculative. Third, even if this transmission route were correct, it would not prove that the story remained accurate as it passed through several people. Fourth, if Mark, Matthew, and Luke ultimately relied on the same tradition, then they would not represent independent corroboration. And fifth, if Luke had explicitly identified Joanna as the source, the connection would be more historically useful but less plausibly undesigned. This shows how serious a challenge literary dependence and shared community traditions create for the argument from undesigned coincidences. If two accounts describe different matters and are not explicitly connected, then the alleged connection may exist only in the imagination of the apologist. We cannot simply assume that one passage explains the other, but if the text clearly connects the details, then the possibility of deliberate clarification becomes stronger, and the likelihood that the coincidence was genuinely undesigned decreases. And even if there is a real connection that was not deliberately emphasized, it still does not establish independent corroboration if both accounts ultimately derive from the same source or shared tradition. A convincing example of an undesigned coincidence would therefore need to satisfy several demanding conditions. The connection between the accounts would need to be sufficiently clear that we are not merely inventing it. At the same time, we would need good reason to think that the authors were not deliberately constructing the connection. We would also need evidence that the authors were drawing from genuinely independent sources rather than copying one another or relying on the same pool of church tradition. Something like that may be possible in principle, but it is extremely difficult to establish in the New Testament because the Gospel authors generally do not identify their sources. The texts were produced within interconnected Christian communities, and the Synoptic Gospels display clear literary dependence. That is why this example does not solve the problem. It exposes the problem. So what do you think? Is it still reasonable to call this an undesigned coincidence, or have I shown that McGrew's argument depends on too many unsupported assumptions? Let me know in the comments. I would love to hear your thoughts. If you found this video helpful or interesting, please consider supporting my work on Patreon. The link is in the video description. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.